This really did not end the way I thought it was going to end. Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber, and this is Winnie the Westie getting ready for his afternoon nap. And there have been developments in the Mark and Patricia McCloskey prosecution, and I've got to say, this did not end
the way I thought it was going to end.
Mark and Patricia McCloskey are the St. Louis, Missouri couple who were indicted on gun charges for brandishing firearms at a group of protesters who apparently burst through a fence onto a private street in search of the mayor's house, in front of which they wanted to protest. And Mark and Patricia McCloskey, fearing apparently for their lives and their safety and the well-being of their property, stood on their porch with two firearms pointed at the crowd of protesters, telling them to move on. The video of the incident went viral. It generated some of the more memorable internet memes out there, and the McCloskeys were ultimately indicted on gun charges for having brandished firearms in a menacing or angry manner at the crowd, and people were up in arms.
Pun intended.
Because this was deemed to be a Second Amendment violation where they could not even avail themselves to the right to bear arms for the purposes of protecting their home. Some of the incidental controversy to all of this is that the prosecuting circuit attorney Kim Gardner apparently exploited of this situation in order to use it for fundraising purposes for her re-election campaign. She was subsequently taken off the file because it was deemed to be a conflict of interest to have used this incident in order to raise money for her re-election campaign. Kim Gardner was removed as the prosecuting attorney from both the Mark and Patricia McCloskey prosecution. They had a special prosecutor appointed to the file, and Kim Gardner found herself in some other problems unrelated to this incident. But Kim Gardner's alleged exploitation of the prosecution of the McCloskeys in order to raise money for her re-election campaign was not the only controversy, was not the only accusation of alleged misconduct in the context of the investigation into the McCloskeys. In the context of the investigation into the McCloskeys for their alleged crime, they had the two firearms at issue confiscated from them, and apparently the pistol that Ms. McCloskey was holding was not functional when it was seized by the investigators, because apparently it was being used or had been used as a prop in a file that Ms. McCloskey was an attorney in, and so they had put the firing pin in a way such that the weapon itself could not be fired. Well, the charges that were brought against the McCloskeys required the firearm to be readily capable of lethal use, and when the investigators seized the firearm and determined that it was not readily capable of lethal use, they had to disassemble it and reassemble it so that it would be readily capable of lethal use, so that Ms. McCloskey could be charged under that statute. And after the investigators disassembled the firearm, reassembled the firearm so that it could be rendered readily capable of lethal use, the McCloskeys themselves were the ones charged with tampering with evidence. What? What the fuck? So that is the corruption as relates to the investigation of the McCloskeys themselves, but it doesn't end there for Kim Gardner. She also recently became the object of alleged professional misconduct violations in a 73-page court filing. I did a video on that one as well. Whoever would have thought that a corrupt prosecutor
would have a history of corrupt prosecution?
So that is the backdrop of the prosecution of the McCloskeys. A lot of people feel that they were wrongly charged in the first place, in that they were only exercising their Second Amendment rights to self-protection. They were arguably the subject of malicious prosecution, in that Kim Gardner was exploiting of that prosecution in order to raise money for her re-election campaign, and they were arguably the subject of evidence tampering, in that the investigators disassembled a firearm, reassembled it in order to make it readily capable of lethal use to charge Ms. McCloskey. All the while, the initial prosecuting attorney herself is facing serious misconduct allegations, and what ends up happening in this case, it doesn't go to trial, the charges are not dropped, the McCloskeys apparently plead guilty to a lesser misdemeanor charge. From Fox News, St. Louis couple Mark Patricia McCloskey pay fines, lose guns in guilty plea over encounter with rioters. Quote, "If we didn't have somebody named George Soros in the world, we would never have been charged with anything," end quote, Mark McCloskey said. First parentheses here, if anybody doesn't get the George Soros reference, we're going to get to it a little later in the article, but that also means you don't watch my live streams with Robert Barnes, because we have discussed this. George Soros or George Soros entities apparently heavily financed the re-election campaign of the likes of Kim Gardner and other state prosecutors. Second parentheses, it's going to be very easy for everyone out there to say what the McCloskeys ought to have done. They they should have fought to the bitter end. It's very easy for everyone behind the comfort of their computer who don't have to incur the costs and the stress of protracted litigation to say what other people should do. We fully recognize that. So while I might be surprised and a little disappointed by the outcome of this, it's not up to me to second guess what the McCloskey's ought to have done. It is their life, it is their time, it is their money, it is their decision alone to make. Also, as far as it goes, we do not have full information. We do not know all of the details. We do not know if something wasn't going the McCloskey's way, if something came up that was unfavorable to the McCloskey's such that they felt pressured to accept this deal. So we don't have complete information. It is very easy for us to judge what others have decided to do. With that said, let's get into the decision of what the McCloskey's did in this case. The St. Louis, Missouri couple who went viral after staring down a group of protesters from their front porch have agreed to plead guilty to lesser charges in connection with the incident, pay fines, and lose the guns seized during the investigation. Mark and Patricia McCloskey, two attorneys in their 60s, were charged in the summer of 2020 after a swarm of Black Lives Matter protesters broke down an iron gate and ignored a, quote, no trespassing, end quote, sign on their private street. The couple said they felt threatened and armed themselves before heading outside to warn off the crowd, which was on its way to the former mayor's home. No one was hurt. You gotta love the way Fox News is framing and describing this story, but let's compare that to another outlet that might be a little less favorable to the McCloskey's, like, say, CBC News. Missouri couple who waved guns at protesters plead guilty. Mark and Patricia McCloskey brandished their weapons when hundreds of protesters walked past their home. It is quintessential one screen, two films, but let's get back to the Fox News adaptation of this story just to get some more details. Quote, they dropped all the weapons charges and they charged me with the lowest level of misdemeanor, which is something called assault 4, which alleges that I purposely placed at least one other person in apprehension of immediate physical injury, end quote, Mark McCloskey told Fox News over the phone after returning from court Thursday. Quote, I said, well, I guess I did. That was all point of the guns, end quote. Now here's where I predict a lot of people are going to have some very serious problems with what Mark McCloskey has said and done, and I say this full well knowing that I am a Canadian. We do not have Second Amendment rights up here in Canada the way they do down in the United States, but I think a lot of people who are Second Amendment supporters in the United States are going to take issue with what Mark McCloskey has said and done here. The entire perceived injustice of the prosecution of the McCloskey's in this case is that they used firearms for the purposes of self-defense. They were exercising their Second Amendment rights and they were prosecuted for having done so. People were understandably arguing that if the McCloskey's got indicted for doing what they did, for brandishing firearms to protect themselves from a group of protesters outside their property, that if they got prosecuted for doing this, they basically have no Second Amendment rights in the United States anymore. The fact that it might be a misdemeanor and not a felony means that it's only a lesser crime, but what Mark McCloskey is effectively saying here is that he exercised his Second Amendment rights, he brandished a firearm to protect his person and property, and he pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor for having done so. A lot of people are rightly going to conclude that that means you have no Second Amendment rights in Missouri. And potentially the bigger issue for Mark McCloskey is that he is currently running for Senate in Missouri, and I have a sneaking suspicion that what he has done here might very well cost him his Senate run. For whatever the reason, perhaps for personal convenience, perhaps to save money, perhaps because he knew that there was something serious in those charges, he has pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge for basically exercising his Second Amendment rights, and I think that might tick a lot of people off. Quote, it's the value of the Second Amendment, end quote, McCloskey said. Quote, it's kind of humorous for me at any rate, the charge they finally settled on for me, because it's exactly what I did do. That's the whole point of the Second Amendment. We stood out there with guns, and that placed them in imminent fear of physical injury, and they back off, end quote. Yeah, except you just pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge for having done just that, so you effectively confirmed the criminalizing of exercising your Second Amendment rights, Mr. McCloskey. At least that's how I predict a lot of people in the United States are going to see it, whether they be Second Amendment supporters or prosecutors who want to criminalize exercising Second Amendment rights. The couple's guns, seized after their initial arrest last year, will be destroyed, even though McCloskey's attorney asked in court for the judge to allow his rifle to be donated to a charity auction. Quote, the good news is we're not in front of charges now, so I don't have any problem getting myself another AR, end quote, he said. Well, at least not for now, but that's assuming that a potentially corrupt prosecutor doesn't decide to come after you for something else, and that also presupposes that you don't get into other trouble for having pleaded guilty to this misdemeanor, I don't know, like with your bar society or something. Now, according to the CBC article, because the McCloskey's pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges, they don't actually face the possibility of losing their law license and they can continue to own firearms, but a lot of people are going to be very disappointed with the fact that the McCloskey's seemingly bent over to the pressure instead of standing up for Second Amendment rights. The end result is what should have happened from the get-go if the incident hadn't been politicized by the local prosecutor, McCloskey said. Quote, if we didn't have somebody named George Soros in the world, we would never have been charged with anything, end quote, he said. The case's initial prosecutor, Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner, was sidelined by a judge judge and replaced with a special prosecutor after flaunting the ongoing proceedings in fundraising emails. Michael Ruiz is a US and world reporter for Fox News. Now, there are people out there hypothesizing that one of the reasons for which the McCloskey's might have pleaded guilty to this lesser misdemeanor charge is that the governor of Missouri had already announced that he was going to pardon the McCloskey's. I have a little bit of trouble understanding or accepting this argument, because if they were going to get pardoned by the governor, they were going to get pardoned by the governor anyhow. They may as well have fought a little bit harder. So the rest of us out there are going to continue hypothesizing as to why the McCloskey's would have pleaded guilty to this misdemeanor charge. Was there something bad in the file that they knew of that we didn't? We may never know. Did they do it to avoid the costs and inconvenience and risks of prosecution? We may never know. Did Mark McCloskey do it because he thought it would help with his Senate run? We may never know, although we will find out if it does indeed help him in his Senate run, and I don't think it will, but that's just my prediction. But that is it, the rather surprising and to some extent anticlimactic end to this legal saga, which I have been following from day one, and I've even made a playlist of all the videos called
Keeping Up with the McCloskey's.
If there are any other developments in this particular case, I will do an update vlog as the case may be. I will continue to follow the professional misconduct allegations against Kim Gardner, because that is a juicy file as well. And with that said, if you like my videos, you like my content, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment in the comment section below, because it feeds the algorithm.
Please, sir, I want some more.
If you want to support the channel, all of these support links are in the pinned comment. We've got PayPal, Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube membership. We've got merch, anti-media, I like this one. Robert Barnes and I do weekly streams every Sunday. We do weekly streams with a guest every Wednesday called The Sidebar. We are also on Locals. If you want to support us there, you can find us at
VivaBarnesLaw.locals.com.
All of my content is also on Rumble, so you can check it out there. But more important than any of that, take care of yourselves, check in on friends and family, make sure everyone around you is doing well, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Booyah!